Hi everyone, Lisa here from the Astro Insights blog. I just thought I'd give you a quick update on a couple of things because we've got the May June eclipses coming up, and I had a look at the chart and I could see that there was some potential here to kind of affect a few things possibly in the market. So I thought it might be an idea just to have a look at some of the charts and some of the trends that are coming up and how this could possibly play out, particularly for Bitcoin. So let's get into it and see what we can see. So here we've got the chart for the supermoon lunar eclipse in Sagittarius that's going to be happening on the 26th of May. So we had a similar eclipse last year also in Sagittarius, and this was the beginning of the new Saros family that was kind of coming in. We were phasing out the Capricorn Cancer cycles and moving into the Gemini Sagittarius one. So now we've got a kind of repeat of that. Now this is going to have resonances on a couple of levels. The first is that it's closing out the 6-month cycle we started back in December 2020. And of course, this was a huge time for Bitcoin. This was really when the bull market kind of took hold, is when investors really started to pile in and to buy, and it's when price skyrocketed up to kind of all-time highs. And this, this coincided with a couple of things. The Bitcoin, in the Bitcoin chart, we had the Jupiter return, so this is what's considered a very auspicious time. And it's interesting that in this chart, I don't know if you can see, but sort of around here we've got Jupiter in Pisces. It's newly ingressed into Pisces, and it actually happened the day after Elon's tweet, so that may be significant. Now Jupiter is going to be making a T-square to the moon and the sun. You can see this great big red triangle that's happening here. So the moon is here in Sagittarius, the sun is in Gemini with the North Node, and I think this is going to be significant purely because Jupiter has changed signs. So back in December we had Jupiter coming together with Saturn on just after the solstice, and this usually starts a 20-year cycle, a new 20-year cycle. So we're not only kind of we're sort of moving on from that now. So that almost resets. It's often associated with market resets. So interesting that we had Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius. We've now got Jupiter moving out of Aquarius. You can see here Saturn is still in Aquarius, but Jupiter's just moved out of Aquarius, which is the sign of technology, and it's very much kind of in sync. It's simpatico with the idea of crypto, and it's moved into Pisces, which is much more esoteric and kind of spiritual in nature. It's less about the sort of material and more about the the celestial, the sort of the etheric, the all things kind of spiritual. So it's kind of almost now in the opposite energy. And of course Jupiter expands things. Jupiter's associated with bull markets and with expansion. So to have Jupiter now in a T-square to the sun and the moon, I think is going to be significant. I think it's going to be the start of a kind of decline of bull sentiment, and I also think what we're going to see is possibly a little bit of denial, because sometimes when Jupiter's in Pisces, or when you get a beautiful T-square, you can sometimes get slightly kind of skewed perceptions, shall we say. So it could be that some people are still overly bullish and are kind of denying that perhaps we're in a little bit of a bear cycle. We could also see some risk-taking, so just something to be aware of. The other thing to say, of course, from the point of view of eclipse astrology, is that this lunar eclipse is closing out that 6-month cycle that began at the Sagittarius solar eclipse back in December. So it's almost as though what began then, which was that kind of that bull run, is almost now not necessarily coming to a conclusion, but we're kind of reaching a pivot point, an important pivot point. Particularly when it comes to sentiment, investor sentiment. The sun and the moon for me are very much associated with pivots in the marketplace. So the moon in particular is very much associated with that sort of market psychology, herd mentality that often drives markets, particularly on the retail side. So I think that we're going to see quite a big shift here in terms of outlook and sort of sentiment. So here we've got the Gemini Solar Eclipse, and this happens on the 10th of June 2021. So this is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's going to start a new 6-month cycle that will take us to November, December, when we have our next set of eclipses. So this one's interesting for a number of reasons, but in relation to markets, what's significant about this in particular is that it occurs very close to the second square of Saturn and Uranus. So Saturn, the planet that is still in the sign of crypto, Aquarius, will be approaching a square to Uranus, which is the sign that rules technology. It's the planet that rules technology, rather. Now what's interesting is that the first time they made their square was mid-February, and of course we had that huge correction on the Nasdaq. So definitely a correlation here between the Saturn-Uranus squares, which are going to be happening again in December. So again, around about the next eclipse season. So I do think that this is going to be very significant for markets and for market psychology, particularly for Bitcoin. Generally speaking, Saturn is very constrictive. It tends to be about the conventional, about, if you think about institutions and how conservative they are traditionally, how they want to cover themselves when it comes to regulation, they don't want to be seen to be sort of stepping outside of anything that's too radical, don't want to spook their investors. So you've got that kind of constricting, somewhat more like requiring structure. And this is something I did talk about in the blog post that I did called Bitcoin Comes of Age. I did say that I expected some volatility as a result of the Saturn-Uranus set of squares. So they always happen in threes. So we had the first one in February, kind of mid-February. The second one is going to happen on the 14th of June, and the third one will happen on Christmas Eve 2021. So these three are going to kind of mark the year. They're going to sort of be a predominant theme, and I think what it does tend to cause is a little bit of fear, a bit of panic, sometimes a bit of catastrophe thinking, a tendency to be a bit erratic, because Uranus is a little bit unpredictable and erratic. Saturn tends to kind of constrict and want to sort of impose rules or laws. So I think we could see a lot of talk around regulation of Bitcoin, for example, various countries sort of making noises about banning it or introducing regulations. On the other hand, you're going to get the crypto community, which I think is going to be represented by that Uranus in Taurus, which is going to want the crypto market to remain organic and for it to be a sort of a much more free and organic community that's been sort of developing around crypto since the inception of Bitcoin in when was it, 2009. So I think that there's going to be this tension between institutions and what institutions require, and then on the other hand the Bitcoin community. And I think we've already seen that with the whole Elon Musk debacle. I think he was really just actually an example of what is turning out to be a kind of wider issue, a wider concern amongst institutions, particularly in America, that are concerned about what they're calling blood coin, which is basically a sort of a euphemism for this idea of not necessarily always knowing what the provenance is of bitcoins that are mined and whether they use hydrocarbon forms of based forms of energy to mine the bitcoin or not, because of course a lot of big funds are taking hydrocarbons out of their portfolios because of course there's increasing pressure to introduce stricter sort of greenhouse gas emission sort of rules and to reduce hydrocarbons in the atmosphere as the kind of focus on the climate gets louder and louder. So I think that that issue is going to continue to grow. It isn't necessarily true, and I think there's going to be, it does create a lot of fear and confusion though, a lot of fear, uncertainty and doubt, and I expect that to sort of continue for at least 3 months, if not 6 months. So yeah, a couple of things to point out. So we've got the Sun and the Moon here in Gemini, and they are going to be making a square to Neptune in Pisces here. any kind of Neptune square causes a lot of confusion. So I think this can coincide with things like misinformation in the public domain, a lot of FUD, as they call it, a lot of nonsense and kind of fake news on social media, propaganda possibly, or people with vested interests saying things that confuse investors. So just something to be aware of. I talked about this, I think, last year when we had the same set of eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius, and I said that Gemini rules things like the media, the news, politics, media announcements, anything public, PR, that kind of thing. You can see we've got quite a big stellium here of the Sun, the Moon and Mercury, and of course Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, so that's quite a strong placement for Mercury. But Mercury here is retrograde, and that's always bad news when it comes to clear perception, clear communication. You often get misinformation, miscommunications, misunderstandings, but also problems with technology often, particularly with broadcasts. We often see problems in the banking sector where banks, suddenly their systems go down or fail, that type of thing. So just something to be aware of. If you've got a crypto cold storage wallet, or you are all concerned about hacking, I would take some extra measures. I'd hide my passwords. I would make sure that my antivirus software was up to date, and that I didn't use Wi-Fi in unsecured areas, that kind of thing. So just something to be aware of, particularly when you get this combination of Mercury retrograde, a square to Neptune, can be deceptive, can also represent breaches, kind of security breaches, particularly digital security breaches, theft, deception, that kind of thing. The other thing, of course, is that the luminaries will be approaching a trine to Saturn in Aquarius. Now that's good news. Saturn unfortunately will be retrograde, so I think what that is likely to do is it's likely to sort of bring up we may revisit past issues or scenarios. So it's possible that at this point we may find out more about why Elon made the sort of policy decisions that he did, or something to do with the period that we had between January and now, the first half of the year, with regards to Bitcoin and the Bitcoin cycle. We could also hear maybe some positive news coming out of institutions or governments, possibly re-endorsing Bitcoin. For example, India is rethinking its policy on Bitcoin after kind of banning it. They're now saying that the committee who initially did their investigation had old information, so they are revisiting this issue. So we could possibly see some reversals of policy decisions on Bitcoin that could be quite positive, actually. So here we've got the Bitcoin chart with the solar eclipse transposed kind of on top of it, and this is the outside of this chart is the eclipse, and then the Bitcoin chart is the bit in the middle, and then this is the angles and aspects. But I don't know if you can see, but the Sun and the Moon are here in the 11th house, which is the house of groups, social media, organizations, that type of thing, and that Neptune is here in the 8th house, and it's quite close to the Bitcoin Uranus. Now Uranus in the chart rules the descendant, so this for me does kind of point to some sort of outside interference from a kind of a particular individual or player, somebody who perhaps wants to undermine Bitcoin. It could be a state, it could be an institution, it could be an individual that may want to kind of undermine Bitcoin on some level, or possibly given that Uranus rules the descendant, it may want to kind of like somehow undermine the agency or the independence of Bitcoin as a sort of a currency that exists outside of the sort of centralized banking system, or it's outside at the moment of most of rules and regulations really, and jurisdictions in terms of legal jurisdictions. So it's possible that somebody may want to kind of undermine that, and obviously it's in the interest of certain states who may want to collect tax, say. They may feel that they're missing out on revenue, and of course a lot of countries are the purse strings are quite sort of tight at the moment after all that quantitative easing and COVID grants and things that happened in 2020. So that's entirely possible that there may be this kind of undermining of the independence of Bitcoin and the sort of direct peer-to-peer type of arrangement that we currently have with regards to investors, and the Bitcoin market. So that's something to bear in mind. And then we talked about Saturn. Here's Saturn sitting right on the descendant. So this for me definitely raises the possibility of some kind of, look at this. These are right on the angles of the Bitcoin chart. You've got that Saturn-Uranus square happening on the descendant and the midheaven of the Bitcoin chart. So for me, this is very, very significant. Any planets, particularly outer planets, that sit near to major, the angles, so either the ascendant, descendant, the midheaven, or the IC, are going to be very significant. And here we've got a major, major square between two outer planets happening on the two of the angles of the Bitcoin chart. So I do feel as though this, whatever happens around about this second Saturn Uranus square, is going to influence the future direction of travel for Bitcoin, where Bitcoin is going to be headed, possibly even its future. So it could be that regulation, there's some kind of regulation or attempts by institutions, possibly here represented by Saturn, to kind of to take control of Bitcoin. There may also be it may also face stiff competition from other platforms or other currencies, other cryptocurrencies like Ethereum. You can see institutions kind of gravitating towards Ethereum and the stable coins, and of course most of them run off the Ethereum network, because of course the value of those coins is pegged to the dollar, and that's nice because it means that the price doesn't change that much from kind of week to week. And so we could see possibly Bitcoin being undermined a little bit as a result of that. But as I say, I do think that whatever happens, this is definitely going to affect the future of Bitcoin. You can see Saturn is sitting right on the north node of the Bitcoin chart, and that is usually a kind of a destiny type of a fated event, or sort of a fated action, usually by some kind of large parental organization, state, law, structure, that kind of thing. Or it could be that, Bitcoin security gets increased, but generally speaking, though, a square is quite negative. It introduces tension, it introduces volatility. So, I do think that whatever happens kind of around about this time is going to be very, very significant. So those are my main thoughts about Bitcoin. The other thing that I thought was worth mentioning is the sort of 18.5-year Gann cycle, which a lot of people use when it comes to financial modeling. And I did an article back in 2014 all about financial astrology and the Gann cycles in relation to eclipse cycles, which we call Saros cycles. We organize these into eclipse families, and these very often kind of produce a sort of a clear theme, a thematic thread that runs from one cycle to another. So, for example, if we have a look here at this table of Saros cycles, which Gann came up with, William Gann, he said that if we look at the last cycle that happened, which he kind of puts them into sort of 20-year kind of slots almost. You can see that each of these columns is a sort of more or less a 20-year cycle. So the previous cycle that ran from about 1988 to 2008. And of course, the 2008 marked this sort of the major financial kind of global crash. And of course, stock market plummeted. We had the banks having to be bailed out and that kind of thing. So you can see how that marked this sort of end of one cycle. And he says that that usually coincides with extreme low stock prices, strikes, repression, this feeling of despair, but it's also the time to buy. You know, this is kind of that classic Warren Buffett, you know, when there's blood running in the streets, then you kind of buy because you're kind of getting this is when everything's kind of bottomed out. So it's interesting, though, if we look at sort of portions of the cycle. So, for example, the mid-cycle correction was in 2001, and this is associated with, let me see, where's 2001? So around about here in the sort of G, which he says is kind of like low stock prices. So you get panic and then you get low stock prices. And of course, around about this time we had the tech bubble, and then it was followed by the World Trade Center terrorist attacks, and that really kind of shook the tourism industry and people around the world. It was this kind of double whammy, and it led to a kind of mini recession. So that's perfectly in keeping with his cycle. So we had the tech bubble popping, and then we had the World Trade Center attacks, and that did cause a kind of a mid-cycle correction, but it didn't last terribly long. And then, you know, he points to 2004. This coincides with J. You can see this blue line here, and this he associates with major panic, crashes, stock market crashes, and 4 years of falling prices. And of course, you know, from 2004 to 2008, we essentially moved into that the period where the bubble burst in the housing market. We had the subprime crash, and then the, you know, the stock market and so on sort of followed. So, you know, this culminated in the 2007-2008 global financial crash. So I thought it would be interesting to look at what is kind of, you know, likely to come next. So here we've got the next cycle. This is the current cycle that we're in, which began more or less around about 2007-2008. So you always take it back 2 years in his cycle, because obviously it's a 20-year cycle, but you're basing it on an 18.5 year Sauer cycle. So there's a little bit of a kind of overlap at the beginning and the end of each cycle. So interestingly here, you know, he's kind of saying that, sorry about this. So interestingly here we can see that 2008 was the best time to buy stocks in terms of this cycle. We then moved into a mid-cycle property bubble, which was the best time to sell property. That was 2012. Then some red flags started emerging. We had a kind of mid-cycle slump in around about 2015, and then you can see here red flags again starting to emerge in 2019, which is interesting because some people did start to say around about 2019 that, oh, you know, we're in a bit of a bubble waiting for it to crash, and of course in 2020 it did, and look, this is where the stock market is supposed to fall. So you can see 2001 here, 2020 here. So last year's stock market crash was the mid-cycle correction, and I did actually say that in my forecast for the full moon in Virgo, I think, that I was expecting it to crash and then for there to be a very swift correction, and we did end up having a V-shaped recovery. So that kind of held to Gann's cycle, and then you can see that we moved into what he calls the bubble phase. So this is H, and this is all about speculation, very high stock prices, above all extravagance, the most debt, and a lot of speculation. And so in terms of Gann cycles, you know, we can expect this to last for 2021 right through until 2022. You know, we're getting a lot of people saying, well, you know, they think the stock market is going to crash this year. But, you know, if the Gann cycles are right and if they are still working, then this suggests that we won't have a major stock market correction this year, that it will actually be into 2023. So you can see that this 2023 is the start of that decline that we had in 2004. So 4 years of decline, which takes us to around about 2026, 2027, which is where the property market crashes. And basically, you know, this is likely to be where the stock market crashes, and then the property market, you know, follows in his cycle. So this is stock market and equity decline here. This is J, and you can see that also in this row we've got the 1930s depression, which was of course caused by Black Tuesday on October 29, 1929. So very interesting, correlations. His cycle, his kind of, his map does seem to sort of hold up. So, just kind of by way of summary, this is the cycle that we're closing out, is this total solar eclipse that happened on the 14th of December 2020, with the lunar eclipse that's happening on the 26th of May in Sagittarius. And then we start a new cycle here on the 10th of June 2021 with this solar eclipse in Gemini. And then that will continue until the 19th of November 2021 when we have a lunar eclipse in Taurus. So hopefully that should sort of stabilize things a little bit. And then we end the year with a solar eclipse again in December, which is in Sagittarius again, so similar to to 2020. So we'll have to see what kind of happens. But I think it's fair to say that if we look at the the eclipse itself, this 10th of June eclipse, that we certainly can expect a bit of volatility with the square happening between Uranus and Taurus and Saturn in Aquarius, but hopefully there'll also be some good news as a result of the trine from the luminaries here in Gemini to Saturn retrograde in Aquarius. So hopefully we will kind of revise a few things, or we'll kind of go back to a few things. People are kind of wondering in terms of the Bitcoin cycle whether we've kind of broken the model or not. Perhaps this indicates a reversion back to the kind of back to normal, if you like. But yeah, certainly a lot of volatility. Trying to think what else I can say. Well, I mean, in terms of, I suppose we can kind of finish on a high note by saying that this Saros series, this is for the Gemini lunar eclipse, Gemini solar eclipse, sorry, on the 5th of June. This is part of the Saros family known as 5 North, according to Bernadette Brady, and she associates this with sudden flashes of intuitive insight, hunches, visions, prophetic dreams, as well as creative inspiration and channel information. So I think it's a good idea, if you are kind of trading, to really pay attention to your intuition. If you get sort of something in the back of your mind saying, it might be a good idea to sort of take a trade now, or maybe I should close that trade out, I think it's worth listening, because your intuition is going to be kind of pinging quite a lot, and that will help to steer you through the confusion caused by Mercury retrograde and that square to Neptune, which, as I said, can lead to a bit of FUD and a bit of confusion. So yeah, I hope that's been useful. As I said, I didn't want to make this too long. I'm going to do a slightly more in-depth one, astrology-wise, for my astrology website, the astrologysphere.com. But I hope you've enjoyed it. Do let me know if you'd like to see more forecasts like this. And yes, wishing you all the very best for the upcoming eclipse season.